Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the historical overview of the Renaissance. And just to pick up with where we left off last time, we were taking a look at kind of the end of the story of the Renaissance, its legacy, and some of the important principles that come out. I couldn't cover all of them, but I just selected a handful of them to take a look at and to have us think about how important this particular era is. And as we go through today, as we take a look at the historical moments, part of my job, at least this is part of the responsibility that I've taken on myself, to go through this class, is to get you to think about going to Europe and kind of getting excited about actually traveling there one day and seeing some of these great works of art and great places that we're going to talk about. So I'll do my best to see by the end of the semester. You can let me know how well I did, and as you go there, part of the job I'm hoping to accomplish is to arm you with some information, some context to know what you're seeing and why it's historically important. And so today we're going to take a look at the overview of the Renaissance and what actually happened within that leads to these important discoveries that we talked about. That there would be no discovery of the New World, or there would be no Galileo and his telescope, and this excitement and fervor that happens around this time about this ever-growing, increasing world and universe that we lived in, which creates immense thought and creativity and imagination, that it wouldn't have happened without the Renaissance, and the Reformation wouldn't have happened without the Renaissance. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about that story today, and some of the things that I talk about how some of these ideas actually lead to the Reformation. But we'll kind of get there. I wanted to talk first about the term, what the Renaissance means. Right, Renaissance is Italian for rebirth. Traditionally, the interpretation suggests that the Renaissance sought a rebirth of the importance of art, culture, and ideas in the Western world. It is as though the world lapsed into darkness in the Middle Ages. This means that there was little academic or philosophical inquiry and little cultural developments, right? In some ways, that's the kind of the traditional understanding of what the Renaissance means, right? So we think of things in it's as though we see human civilization in major epics, or kind of like telling a story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And traditionally, we generally tend to think of ourselves, whatever age it is kind of towards the end of whatever story of human development we're at. And so as the Renaissance was picking up, they generally thought of the era that came before it as the middle point. And they're now in this modern world. And we still kind of think of it in that sense today, that this, since the 1400s, we're now living in this modern age. But in some ways, that traditional interpretation is true. Europe did regress from a booming economic and cultural powerhouse into more of an agrarian subsistence kind of existence. So in some ways that is true, right? The traditional definition suggests that people lost contact with education and great scholars and thinkers of antiquity, such as Plato, Aristotle, Homer, Ovid, Virgil, etc., right? In the church, we kind of think about this similarly, right? We talk about this in terms of the apostasy, right? The light of Christ was taken from the earth, and the world lapsed into spiritual darkness. Right? The world doesn't see the Middle Ages necessarily as spiritual darkness, but it does see it in terms of intellectual and cultural darkness. However, this definition of the Renaissance, right, is a bit tricky because people never really lost sight of their ancient ideas. And so maybe the intellectual and cultural darkness is a bit limited, to say the least, right? The error is that they thought that there was not a lot of art or writing or intellectual developments that occurred during this time, and that's not entirely correct. There was actually a lot of art, a lot of writing, a lot of intellectual development. To some extent, people during the Middle Ages lost some of their classical roots, but most of this loss has been over-exaggerated. Aristotle was extremely important to thinkers of the Middle Ages, for instance. Virgil was read by some. Now, the amount of knowledge during this time was limited, and there was not a lot of people who were educated during the Middle Ages. We talked about that, right? How education changed, and it became more of a Christian-driven endeavor. So in part, that idea of the less intellectual developments is true, but it's not as though they completely lost touch with antiquity, right? It's not as though Europe has regressed into becoming baboons or monkeys or something like that. There still were developments, and so it's a little bit overly simplistic to say that this is entirely a rebirth, right, of civilization. That's not entirely true, right? There's some truth to it, but it's a little bit oversimplistic to say that. Something that is important, something that does change, and I think that the definition of the Renaissance does apply to is the renewed interest in artistic values. The Renaissance saw a rebirth of artistic values of antiquity. They saw a re-importance of classical pagan ideas. And Florence becomes the birthplace of this cultural development. And so here you see a map of Europe at the time. You can see Italy is kind of divided into three or four-ish segments here. They have the papal states, and there was actually, the papacy did own actual land, and they had a military. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And then there's Naples to the south, and then you have some areas that's mainly owned by what is known as the Holy Roman Empire, which, not to be confused with the Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is a small remnant of the Roman Empire. It was just people that were trying to reunite Europe into one region again, but it didn't function the same way. It was mainly just trying to function in name only. It was a way of rebranding themselves, so to speak. Taking a look at the ideas of the Renaissance. When we take a look at the Renaissance, we're going to start with the Italian Renaissance, and then we'll take a look at the Northern Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance is mainly centered in Florence, and we'll take a look at why that is today. I'm going to tell you the story of Florence. And then these ideas are going to then move south slightly to Rome. And so here's a map of Florence, and you can see this kind of republic that we'll talk about, the Republic of Florence, that starts to emerge during this time. And then just a little bit south of that is Rome. And so the reason why it moves south to Rome is we'll talk about the major economic force in Florence starts to die off. And so then the largest patron of the arts becomes the Catholic Church. And so a lot of the ideas then start to move south to Rome. Then we'll take a look at, next week, we'll take a look at the Northern Renaissance and what that means. As these ideas started to catch fire, they started to move northward as well to areas in France, Germany, the Netherlands, and also England. And these new ideas of how to see the world and how to come to new understandings, we see those values becoming extremely influential. So we'll see that within music, we'll see that within art, we'll see that within literature. Shakespeare's part of this new movement of seeing and understanding humans in a different way. So we'll take a look at some of those ideas. Taking a look at some of the similarities and differences between the Northern and Southern Renaissance. There are some similarities between them that link them loosely to an era kind of loosely known as the Renaissance. There's also great differences between them, right? So I don't want you to confuse them. Mainly these differences are between the Italian and Northern humanism, which is what the next lecture is going to take a look at. Northern humanism and Italian humanism are intellectual developments. These intellectual ideas present humanity in different lights, right? They have different focuses. As such, the art, which is what we use to make sense of our world, becomes vastly different between these two Renaissances, right? Between the Renaissance happening in Italy and the one that's happening in the North. And so we'll take a look at some of those differences. But I just want to outline that. We're going to take a look at the Renaissance, but the Renaissance can be divided into two main locations. The Italian Renaissance, or it can be considered the Southern Renaissance, or the North, and then there's also the Northern Renaissance is another part of that as well. Similar, but different. One part of the Renaissance that's important to note is it's really the birth of the modern era. This is going to be something quite different. And I outline this in three main ways. And so as I go through these slides, what I want you to do is to take notes on some of the major ideas with them. And so if I put a bullet point on there, that's because the bullet point is important. And so as you go through this, think about what are the main ideas for that bullet point. How does it fit into the overall theme of the lecture that we're taking a look at? The first one, the first kind of birth of the modern era is the political birth of a new political era. We see new developments that arise that give birth to the modern nation state. Something that's going to then continue on in the next several centuries, but it really starts here, right? Where politics are not controlled by feudal kings or queens or even members of the church. We see during this time people who are not necessarily ordained by God, right? So we see kind of moving away from the divine right of kings. They are just people from the business world that come to power and rule without the Pope's or church's blessing per se. And this is where we're going to see centered in Florence. And here you see another image, the skyline of Florence with the Florence Cathedral in the background. And the Palazzo del Vecchio, this tower-shaped building here. This is the town hall. We'll talk about that. There's actually comes into play a lot within Florentine history. We'll talk about that as we go through some of these ideas. But this is just the skyline, again, to give you the sense of this region in Italy, in the north part of Italy, known as the Tuscan region. And Florence is kind of the central hub of the Tuscan region, right? So when you hear of Tuscany, this is the region that it's referring to. It has a lot of kind of rolling hills and mountains, a lot of grapes. Wine is particularly important today as a means of commerce and also tourism. The second major era that brings this into the modern era are the intellectual developments. And the main intellectual development that we see during the Renaissance is the rise of secularism. We talked about last time the Middle Ages. One of the key components of the Middle Ages was the dominance of Christianity. And so what we see for the first time since antiquity, the movement, a subtle movement away from Christianity. And although that sounds like, particularly within the church, that sounds like a bad thing, in some ways this gives people a way to see the world differently. It gives people a way to scientifically understand the world rather than relying on things such as, well, that's just faith, right? An example of this would be Galileo, right? Galileo used a telescope and he starts studying the movements of the planets. And what he suggests is that we do not live in a Earth-centric universe. We live in a heliocentric universe. And so at the time, it was believed that God created the world to be at the very center of creation. And Galileo starts to say, well, wait a minute, we're not even at the center of our own solar system, right? The sun is the center of the solar system. And so he starts to push that idea and starts to say, hey, you know what? If you actually study the movements of the stars and movements of the planets, you'll start to see that we actually don't. The sun doesn't rotate around the Earth. It's actually the other way around, right? But at the time, that was seen as a threat to the church. The church wanted to excommunicate him, wanted him to recall his ideas. They imprisoned him. They flogged him, which is beating with a stick, and so they beat the bottom of his heels until he recanted and said, you know what, maybe I didn't see what I saw. Maybe these scientific developments aren't what they necessarily I thought that they were, to a point where he walked with a limp for the rest of his life, right? But that's the kind of getting away from that idea that the church is the only way to see things. And in terms of the restoration, right? We needed the ability to move away from the Catholic Church's dogma in order to see the world differently, to see truth. And so we see that idea that those intellectual developments, those secular developments are actually important to get us closer to understanding truth, because truth had been so clouded for over 1,000 years, right? And so it becomes extremely important to as a story of human development, the story of the Renaissance, but also the story of the Restoration. One of the things that becomes particularly important with these intellectual developments is the rise of these ancient ideas from Islam, these ancient ideas from Rome and Greece, and what they're mainly looking for is truth. And we'll take a look at that in a study known as humanism. That'll be our next lecture, just to kind of give you a sense of where we're going. And then the last major development that we can say that the Renaissance is kind of the beginning of this modern era are the artistic developments. We see new trends to recreate realism and produce aesthetic experiences that we're still dealing with to this day, right? The Renaissance casts a large shadow, and part of the focus of their art is to create how the eye sees. And we'll take a look at those artistic developments next week when we take a look at the art of Brunelleschi, the art of Donatello, the art of Michelangelo and Da Vinci. We'll take a look at how they're doing this, and they're changing the way that art is created, and they're changing the way that we see the world within that. Taking a look at, let me give you some sample questions. And so a lot of students ask, how in the world am I supposed to know what to take notes on, right? What are the exams going to look like? So let me give you a couple of sample questions, just in the little bit of information that you have. This is a type of question that I might ask, just to help you out to know what to think about or how to process this information. So in the bottom corner, I'm not giving you, this doesn't necessarily pertain to the question. These are just shots from Florence, and so I'm just trying to again entice you to kind of go out and to see the world. The first question is, in what ways did the printing press change society? A, it helped people to read more. B, it limited the Catholic Church's stranglehold on the minds of the people. C, it helped the Bible to be translated into the vernacular. Or D, all of these. And so this one refers to the last lecture about when we talked about the Gutenberg Bible. We talked about the printing press, right? And so I want you to think about which one is the correct answer. And so as we go through these, one thing to kind of think about is, did this happen, right? Did we talk about this? Did it help people to read more? Yes, because it gave people, it started to have translations into their own vernacular rather than in Latin. And so people were able to read and have access more to literature. And we talked about the high cost of books being brought down because books were then made more readily accessible. It limited the Catholic Church's stranglehold on the minds of the people. Yes, because people were able to now read and think for themselves rather than having to go to the clergy and have them think and interpret information for them. It helped the Bible to be translated into the vernacular. Yes, we see the movements of people like John Wycliffe that are translating the Bible into to English, and so we see this happening throughout. Martin Luther's going to take his own stab at this in German. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we take a look at the Reformation. But the focus is on getting the words of the Bible, the ideas of the Bible, into the common language. And at the time, this was seen as, pretty controversial. Because the question is, should we, Latin is this kind of perceived at the time as this high language, right? The language that we should be using to speak and to write in when we're referring to religious things. And so, the common language is the language of, kind of the guttural or kind of the lower class language. And so should we be taking the words of God and making them into kind of common everyday language? And we can kind of think about that controversy today. What if we were to take the Bible, the King James Version of the Bible, and just write it in today's vernacular, right? Would that be okay, right? And some people would be probably okay with that, and they'd say, you know what, language changes over time, so it's probably okay to kind of relook at it and make it a little bit more accessible. And they are actually doing that. If you've taken a look at the Word on the Street Bible, that's one example of that, and that's changing it more into street vernacular, changing the Bible into more street vernacular. Other people, kind of more the purists, say that's actually defiling, the actual words of God, and how dare you. But that's kind of the discussion that was happening at the time. And so the correct answer to this one is D, all of these, right? Taking a look at this one comes from more kind of a recent discussion that we just had. Which of the following is not part, again, I'm trying to focus on not which one is the correct one, but the one not is supposed to stand out. So find the one that doesn't belong. Which of the following is not part of the reasons that the Renaissance is considered birth of the modern era, right? So these are the things that I just talked about a few slides ago. New political developments, new economic developments, new intellectual trends, new artistic trends, right? So that's getting you to think back a couple slides ago. Which one did I not talk about? The one that I talked about political developments and moving to a modern nation state where people are moving away from kings and queens and the divine right of kings. We talked about the new intellectual trends with humanism and secularism, and we talked about the new artistic values. The one that we didn't talk about were economic developments, and because the economic developments really didn't change that much during the Renaissance. We'll talk about some of the economic developments, but it wasn't like it was a vastly different society due to the economic things, right? So the economy didn't really change all that much, and so that one's the one that doesn't belong to. The correct answer here is B. And the image here that you see is the Ponte del Vecchio, which is Ponte is just a bridge. The Vecchio is just a name. And this is the bridge, one of the famous bridges in Florence that people cross, and there's a lot of trade, a lot of you can buy jewelry and rings, a lot of jewelers on that, and souvenirs that you can buy. And then one of the best things to do in Florence after going to museums all day and kind of being out in the heat is to grab some gelato. And so just again get you thinking about getting your travel ticket ready for when we actually are able to travel again. Okay, here's another one. What two cities did the main developments of the Italian Renaissance occur, right? A, Florence and Milan. B, Rome and Naples. C, Rome and Florence and Rome. D, Rome and Paris. And the correct answer to this one is Florence and Rome. We'll talk about Florence in just a minute. And again, this is just another shot of one of the main business areas, districts in Florence. And right around the corner is kind of interesting left. You kind of have this sense of this, it has like this old kind of Renaissance architecture to it, and it's Florence feels a lot like it does, or it did during the Renaissance. Not a lot has changed except for the businesses, and so you have a Hugo Boss store right here, and then right around the corner is actually kind of humorously an H&M. That's right there. All right, here's another sample question. According to the newer understanding of the term Renaissance, what is wrong with the belief that the Renaissance was a rebirth of values from ancient Greece and Rome, right? A, new evidence suggests that the Renaissance never really sought the values of ancient Greece and Rome. B, new evidence shows that the rebirth of ancient Greek and Roman values did not actually occur until the 1800s. C, new evidence shows that there really was no rebirth because European culture never really lost sight of its emphasis on the values from ancient Greece and Rome, right? Or in D, all of the above. And so as you take a look at all of the above, if there are two that are correct, then they're all correct, right? And so that's one way to start to eliminate the answers in order to find the correct one. And so with this one, as we go through, new evidence suggests the Renaissance never really sought the values of ancient Greece and Rome. That's actually not true. They actually did, and we'll talk about how that becomes ancient values of Greece and Rome are extremely important. New evidence shows that the rebirth didn't actually occur in the 1800s. That one's not true. It actually did happen in the 1400s, and so you can eliminate A and B with that one, and then you could also eliminate D with that one. And then, so the correct answer is C. New evidence shows that there really was no rebirth because European culture never lost sight of its emphasis on the values from ancient Greece and Rome. And so it's not as though, the Middle Ages just completely threw the antiquity out the window. It didn't necessarily emphasize it as much as the Renaissance will, but it still was there. All right, let's take a look at the historical context that gets us to the Renaissance. And for this, I wanted to kind of go back just a little bit here. Talking about the rise of Florence, we need to talk about the moving away from Rome. And so I'm going to cover some ideas that are covered in Humanities 201 here. I'm just going to give a brief overview of the fall of Rome. But it'll give us the understanding of the political climate that Florence finds itself in, right? In the past, Rome was the center of the world, so to speak, right? It was the government seat. It was the capital of the Roman Empire, which held all the public offices and buildings. And here you see the main entertainment center. This is the Colosseum, which looks a lot like a football stadium today. But this was the center of their entertainment. So it was the center of the Roman Empire. It was also the economic capital. It was the center of trade. Most of the commerce was connected in one way or another to Rome. And so it was politically centered in Rome. It was economically centered in Rome. And then as the Christian church rose to power, with Constantine in the 4th century saying, that we need to, become Christians, the church then centered on Rome as well, because it was already the economic and political center. And so with the rise of Christianity, they say, well, why don't not make it the religious center as well? And so the Roman bishop or father known as Papa became the Pope. And so the Pope actually means Papa, right? So the Roman bishop becomes the Pope, and that's where it becomes the center of the world. The result is that Rome was the economic, political, and religious capital of the world for several centuries. It would be like today if New York, Washington, D.C., and I guess Salt Lake moved to New York City, right? It would be the kind of the central hub of the central focus of importance. However, the Roman Empire, through many campaigns around the world, began to spread itself too thin and became vulnerable to surrounding tribes of Goths to the north. There also became problems with revolts. Revolts occurred in the Mediterranean in places like Spain, Northern Europe, and parts of North Africa, mainly seeking to free themselves from the Roman Empire, tired of paying taxes, tired of doing what the Roman Empire wanted to do. They wanted their autonomy, they wanted their independence. The Battle of Adrianople in 370 AD was the beginning of the tidal wave against Rome, right? The beginning of the kind of the revolts and the turning the tide away from Rome's dominance. Other invasions from Germany and Spain occurred in the 5th century, so Rome was beginning to dwindle in power, and as a result, businesses soon left, right? As trade starts to break down, businesses will leave. Rome was fragmented and became a shell of what it once was. To preserve some of its power, the Roman Emperor Justinian realized that the empire was too big to maintain on its own, so he divided Rome into the east and the west. The west was centered in Rome, and the Eastern Empire, what became known as the Byzantine Empire, was centered in Constantinople, which is present-day Turkey. Another problem that the Roman Empire was facing was with mercenaries. Rome began to rely too much on mercenaries who had no desire to fight for a cause that was not their own. They weren't fighting for glory of the empire. They weren't fighting for, God and country. They were fighting for money. So they had a less vested interest in what was happening in Rome and putting their lives on the line. And more Rome had to, people were moving away from becoming, soldiers, and so they had to rely more and more on mercenaries, which, people, when you're fighting for money, you generally don't have a much vested interest in it. Another growing problem that led to the fall of the Roman Empire, and this is kind of a complex history that I'm giving you over several centuries and just kind of consolidating this, but other scholars take a look at the rise of Christianity as part of this, right? Scholars such as Edward Gibbon blame the rise of Christianity as one of the main reasons that Rome fell. Because Christians were largely pacifists and kept to themselves. Edward Gibbon correlates the rise of Christianity with the fall of the Roman Empire, right? So as one was going up, the other was going down, and suggests that these two must be linked, right? Now, while we have to be cautious that correlation doesn't equal causation, Gibbon suggests that this does in this case. People were converting to Christianity, and their allegiance was no longer to the empire or to the emperor, it was to Christ. So I'm not sure that this is entirely a bad thing, right? After all, Rome wreaked a lot of havoc in its day, but it's just one of the contributing factors that leads to the fall of Rome. Whatever the reason, most agree that Rome ceased to function by the 5th century. With the loss of Rome, there was no overarching body of government to tie people together. There was no one to build or maintain roads. There was no one to enforce security on the roads. There was no simplified tax code. There was no overarching laws for trade. There was no unified currency. Europe regressed into more of a primitive agrarian society, right? Not necessarily, the baboons, but they regressed more into less of focusing on merchants and ships and business and trade, and more focusing on subsistence living. The town that you were born in was the town in which you would die, because people didn't travel, right? It was too dangerous.